I was never really good at sitting still when grown ups started talking about things like family trees or long lists of names. But when my uncle told me once that all of us, me, him, even my grandfather, were connected to creatures that lived millions of years ago, I couldn't stop thinking about it. He wasn't just talking about monkeys or chimpanzees. He said that somewhere deep in time, there were apes we hardly knew anything about, and one of them might have been called Ouranopithecus. The name itself felt strange on my tongue, like a secret word from another language. Ouranopithecus. My uncle said it meant something like ancient ape of the heavens, because it was found in Greece. I pictured a big ape looking down from the cliffs, maybe with dark eyes that seemed to hold stories too old for us to understand. But who exactly was this ape? And why do scientists argue so much about whether it could have been one of our ancestors? That's what I wanted to know. The story of Ouranopithecus doesn't start in a busy city or a museum. It begins in dusty hills of northern Greece, where the ground is cracked and the stones are layered like pages in an ancient book. Back in the 1970s, scientists digging there uncovered fossilized bones that didn't quite belong to any ape they had seen before. The jaw was large, the teeth heavy and worn down like tools that had been used again and again. Whoever this creature was, it wasn't small. In fact, it looked powerful, with jaws that could crush the hardest foods. I imagined the scientist brushing away the dirt, sunlight catching the edge of a tooth that had been hidden for over 9 million years. Can you picture that? Holding in your hands something that belonged to a living creature when there were no humans, no cities, no books, not even the idea of history itself. Just rivers, forests, and wide, open skies. Ouranopithecus lived in that world, a world scientists think was already changing. Around 9 million years ago, the lush forests of Europe and Africa were slowly shrinking. Grasslands were spreading, and food wasn't as plentiful in every direction anymore. If you were an ape then, you had to adapt. And Ouranopithecus seemed to be built exactly for that kind of struggle. Its teeth were thick with enamel, like armor, and that meant it could chew foods that other apes maybe avoided: nuts, hard fruits, even roots. Some scientists think that gave it an edge when times were tough. Its face, reconstructed from fossils, was long and wide, not so different from modern gorillas. But here's where it gets really interesting: the bones of Ouranopithecus didn't match gorillas exactly, or chimpanzees, or even orangutans. It was something unique. Something in between. And that's when the big question comes up: could this ape have been a direct ancestor of us, the very first step toward what would become humans? When I first read about that, I didn't understand why it mattered so much. I mean, an ape is an ape, right? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that scientists are like detectives in the biggest mystery ever told, the mystery of where we come from. Every fossil is like a clue, and sometimes the clues point in one direction, then suddenly twist another way. For Ouranopithecus, the clues are confusing. Some say it looks a lot like the ancestors of modern African apes, especially gorillas. Its strong jaws, big teeth, and heavy brow ridges all suggest that. But others argue that maybe, just maybe, it could be closer to the line that led to us, the hominins. I remember staring at a picture in a book once, where Ouranopithecus was drawn standing on all fours, but with a posture that seemed almost too straight, like it could rise up at any moment. I thought about what it would feel like if I could walk through those ancient forests and suddenly see one watching me from the edge of the trees. Would I recognize something familiar in its eyes? Would it recognize me as something distant but connected? The strange thing is, the fossils of Ouranopithecus are mostly skulls and jaws. We don't have arms or legs, not yet. That makes it hard to know exactly how it moved. Did it climb trees like modern chimps? Did it spend more time on the ground like gorillas? Or did it sometimes walk upright, testing the kind of movement that humans would later depend on? That missing piece is what keeps scientists arguing. If we had leg bones, maybe we'd know. If we had a full skeleton, maybe the mystery would be solved. But with only jaws and skull fragments, we're left with questions that stretch across millions of years. Still, the jaws themselves say a lot. They belong to something tough, something that had survived through changes in its world. To me, that feels very human already. Haven't we always been survivors? Haven't we always had to adapt to changing times, changing lands, changing climates? One scientist I read about said that Ouranopithecus might be the last of the great European apes, the ones that thrived in Europe before most apes disappeared there. If that's true, then it's like Ouranopithecus was standing at the edge of one chapter, closing the book on Europe, and maybe opening another in Africa, where our story would truly begin. But then another group of scientists disagreed. They said no, Ouranopithecus was just a cousin, not a parent. A branch that grew strong but eventually withered away, leaving no descendants. I didn't know who to believe, and maybe that's the whole point. The mystery isn't about finding one clear answer, it's about following the clues and imagining what life was like for a creature that lived so long ago. Whenever I thought of it, I imagined Ouranopithecus sitting on a rocky hill, watching the sun dip low. Maybe it chewed on something hard, cracking it between those strong jaws. Around it, the land stretched dry and wide, the trees thinner than before. Other animals roamed, antelope-like creatures, saber-toothed cats, even elephants with long, twisting tusks. Ouranopithecus must have seen it all. And in some quiet way, it was part of the story that would, millions of years later, lead to us. Even though scientists might argue, even though the fossils are incomplete, the idea that a creature from Greece could possibly be tied to the origin of humans makes my imagination race. It makes me wonder if history isn't just about battles and kings and cities, but also about the silent lives of creatures who never knew they were shaping the future. And that's what pulls me back to Ouranopithecus. Because whether it was our ancestor or just our cousin, it reminds us that the story of humans isn't only written in books or carved in stone. It's written in bones buried under layers of earth, waiting for someone to find them, to ask questions, and to wonder. When I closed my eyes after learning about Ouranopithecus for the first time, I kept seeing a face staring back at me. Not a human face, not exactly, but something close. Heavy brow ridges curved like shadows above dark eyes. The nose was wide, the jaw strong, and the mouth seemed built for chewing endlessly. It was almost like looking at a gorilla, but not quite. There was something in between, like a puzzle piece that didn't fully fit any picture we already had. Scientists tried to trace that face, to put it back together from the broken skulls dug up in Greece and a few in Macedonia. That's not easy. Imagine trying to piece together a toy model when half the parts are missing and you don't even know what the final design is supposed to look like. That's what paleontologists face every time they uncover fossils. The Ouranopithecus skull fragments showed a creature larger than most other apes that had lived in Europe before. Its brain case wasn't as big as ours, of course, but it wasn't tiny either. The ridges of bone showed where strong chewing muscles once anchored, pulling against its jaw every time it cracked seeds or gnawed on tough plants. If you've ever chewed something so hard your jaw started to hurt, imagine a creature that did that all day, every day. But what fascinated me was the eyes. The sockets were wide and deep, and I couldn't help but think about what the world looked like through them. Did Ouranopithecus notice the changing seasons? Did it see the grasslands spread where forests once stood? Did it watch storms roll across the sky and find shelter under rocky ledges? Some reconstructions show its face looking almost stern, like a wise old giant. I wondered if maybe that was just how it looked naturally, and if it actually lived more ordinary days grooming its young, searching for food, climbing trees when it needed to. The more I read, the more I realized why its face was so important. In fossils, faces can be maps. They tell scientists how muscles worked, what foods were eaten, and sometimes even who is related to whom. Ouranopithecus's face suggested it was closer to African apes than to orangutans, who had already gone their own way millions of years earlier. But whether it leaned more toward gorillas, chimpanzees, or even early humans, that was still a mystery. One theory I found said that Ouranopithecus could be part of the line that eventually led to African apes and humans together. Another theory argued it was more like an ancient gorilla relative, with no direct link to us. And then there was a bolder suggestion, that Ouranopithecus might actually sit right on the branch that split one path leading to gorillas, the other to us. It was dizzying, thinking about all these branches. I pictured a massive tree with countless twigs and leaves, each one a different species, some alive today, others long gone. Somewhere on that tree, humans sit on one branch, gorillas and chimpanzees on another. The question was Ouranopithecus near the base of that fork, where everything split? When I tried to imagine the tree, I kept drawing it in my notebook, but the branches always got messy. Lines crossed over each other, arrows pointed in every direction. That's how human origins feel, like a map with missing roads, where sometimes you have to guess which path was actually taken. But the face of Ouranopithecus gave some hints. Its teeth were big, with thick enamel, which meant it could handle foods that might have worn down others. Gorillas today also have powerful jaws and teeth, but their diets are different, full of leaves. Humans, on the other hand, also developed thick enamel, and some scientists thought maybe that was no coincidence. Could it be that our teeth carried a memory of creatures like Ouranopithecus? The thought gave me chills. It was like finding out a stranger long ago might have shaped the way you chew your lunch today. Another thing scientists noticed was the size. Ouranopithecus was likely big, maybe close to a gorilla in weight. That meant it wasn't some small tree-dwelling ape. It probably spent a lot of time on the ground. If so, then maybe it had to face predators more often. I pictured hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and big birds of prey watching from above. Living on the ground meant being alert, always ready to defend yourself or your group. And that made me wonder, did Ouranopithecus live in groups, like gorillas and chimpanzees do today? Or was it more solitary? Fossils don't answer that directly, but I like to imagine them moving together, watching over their young, keeping close when the nights grew cold. But still, the arguments continued. Some scientists insisted Ouranopithecus couldn't possibly be in our family tree. They said it was just too different, too specialized. Others argued the opposite, that the very features others saw as specialized might actually be the early steps toward what humans would later need. I thought about how unfair it must feel for Ouranopithecus, stuck in this debate for millions of years after it was gone. To be remembered not for what it was, but only for what it might have led to. Sometimes I tried to think of it not as an ancestor or not ancestor, but just as itself. An ape living its life, unaware of the scientists who would one day study its bones. Maybe its young played in the trees, chasing each other until their arms ached. Maybe mothers held their infants tight when thunder echoed across the hills. Maybe older males sat apart, their massive jaws chewing slowly as they watched the world go by. These weren't just fossils, they were once lives. And in some way, even if Ouranopithecus isn't our direct ancestor, it is still part of our story. Because it shows us the variety of creatures that existed, the experiments of evolution, the endless possibilities of what could have been. When I looked at the sketches of its face again, I noticed how much artists tried to bring it alive. Some gave it brown fur, others black. Some drew it looking like a fierce giant, others like a thoughtful elder. The truth was, no one knew exactly. But every drawing reminded me that behind the bones was once a breathing creature, full of instincts and struggles. And here's the part that stuck with me most, the possibility that Ouranopithecus walked on the very same land where people live today. Greece, a place with cities, villages, and noisy streets, now was once home to this ancient ape. Imagine walking through Athens or Thessaloniki and realizing that millions of years below your feet, the bones of such creatures still lie hidden in stone. That connection between past and present made me feel small, but also amazed. Because even if scientists never fully agree, even if the exact place of Ouranopithecus on the family tree remains blurry, its face still looks back at us across time, asking us to remember. Maybe the real lesson isn't whether it was our ancestor. Maybe it's that every face, every creature that lived before us, carries a part of the long journey that finally reached humans. Ouranopithecus might be a direct ancestor, or just a cousin, but either way, it's part of the greater family of life that shaped who we are today. When I thought of Greece, the first picture that came to my mind was white stone buildings with blue rooftops, the sea stretching out in the distance. But that's the Greece of today. 9 million years ago, when Ouranopithecus lived, it was nothing like that. No cities, no temples, no streets full of people. Back then, it was a land of forests, grasslands, and wide valleys where rivers carved their paths through the earth. The scientists who studied the fossils also studied the soil and the rocks around them. That's how they figured out what the land must have been like. I tried to imagine it, patches of woodland with tall trees, not as dense as a rainforest but enough to give shade. Between the trees stretched open areas where grasses grew tall and animals grazed. It was a world in between, not fully forest, not fully grassland, but something shifting, something changing. And that change was important. Because the apes before Ouranopithecus had mostly lived in lush forests. But here, the land was opening up, forcing creatures to try new ways of living. I pictured Ouranopithecus stepping out from the trees, blinking in the sunlight, scanning the open ground before moving forward. That moment, small as it may have been, felt like the beginning of a bigger story. A story about apes learning to survive outside the safety of thick forests, the same kind of story that would one day lead to humans. The other animals of that time painted the scene even more vividly. Fossils tell us that antelope-like creatures roamed the plains. Big cats, ancestors of saber-toothed tigers, stalked their prey in the shadows. There were elephants too, though not the same ones we know now. Some had long, spiral tusks that curved in wild shapes. The air itself might have been warmer, heavy with the smell of grasses and dry earth. For Ouranopithecus, this was the world it woke up to every day. And that made me wonder, what did a normal day look like for them? Maybe in the mornings, groups of them gathered at the edge of the forest, their dark shapes moving quietly as the sun climbed higher. They would search for food, fruits if they could find them, but also nuts, seeds, and maybe roots dug from the soil. Those thick teeth of theirs, like tools, meant they could chew what others couldn't. That was their advantage. I thought about how much time they must have spent eating. Gorillas today can spend most of the day chewing leaves and stems just to get enough energy. Ouranopithecus, living in a land where food was tougher and not always sweet or soft, probably did the same. Their jaws worked constantly, breaking down whatever they could find. But life wasn't just about eating. It was about safety too. Being a large ape helped, but predators were always near. I imagined a group of Ouranopithecus climbing low branches at night, not too high, but high enough to feel safer. Maybe they huddled close together, their bodies pressed for warmth, their eyes alert for sounds in the darkness. The young ones must have played, just like young apes do today. I could almost hear the rustling of leaves as they chased each other, testing their strength, learning how to climb, swinging from branches even though their kind might not have been as tree-loving as earlier apes. Play was practice for survival, though they didn't know it. When the rains came, the land would have changed again. Rivers swelled, the soil softened, and plants grew in bursts of green. But the dry seasons must have been harsh. Grass turned brittle, fruits scarce. That was when the strength of Ouranopithecus's jaws really mattered. While others starved, maybe it managed to survive by chewing the hardest seeds or breaking open foods no other ape dared to try. I kept coming back to that thought, survival. Because survival is what connects them to us. Every ancestor, every cousin that lived before humans, had to find a way through hunger, predators, and change. If Ouranopithecus wasn't directly our ancestor, then it was at least a mirror showing us what survival looked like when the world demanded toughness. But I also wondered about how they moved. Did they walk on all fours most of the time, like gorillas? Or did they sometimes stand upright, testing a new way of moving across the open ground? We don't know, because the fossils don't include legs or feet yet. But I couldn't help imagining them straightening up, scanning the horizon, their dark eyes watching for danger. That moment standing tall even for a second would feel like a glimpse of the future. In that landscape, posture mattered. On the ground, standing up meant you could see farther. You could spot predators before they spotted you. It also meant your hands were free, maybe to hold food or even carry something. Humans would later take that small advantage and turn it into a way of life. Could Ouranopithecus have been one of the first to test it? The land also shaped their social lives. If food was spread out, maybe they had to travel more, covering wider areas. That would mean working together mattered. A group could share information, watch out for each other, and care for the young. I pictured a mother holding her infant close as others foraged nearby. Maybe older siblings helped, carrying the baby on their backs. Even without words, even without human language, they must have communicated. Apes today use gestures, sounds, and expressions, and I'm sure Ouranopithecus did too. A warning call when danger approached. A comforting sound between mother and child. A stare that showed strength, warning others to keep their distance. These were the seeds of communication, the very beginning of what would one day become speech. The more I thought about their world, the more I realized how much it reflected the changes happening in evolution itself. The shrinking forests, the expanding grasslands, the need for tougher diets, the possibility of walking upright, all these were steps towards something new. Ouranopithecus lived right in the middle of that shift. And maybe that's why scientists argue about it so much. It wasn't just another ape. It was an ape caught in a moment of transformation, living at the edge of what was and what could be. That makes it hard to say for sure whether it was our ancestor, but it also makes it impossible to ignore. When I tried to picture the land one last time, I saw it like a painting, golden grasses bending in the wind, scattered trees with wide branches, shadows of antelope-like creatures moving in the distance. And there, At the edge of the trees, a group of dark figures. Their faces were strong, their bodies heavy, their movements careful but purposeful. They were Ouranopithecus, walking a land that was changing beneath their feet. And whether or not they were truly our ancestors, they were part of the path. Because every step they took, every seed they cracked, every day they survived, added another layer to the long story of life. Without creatures like them, maybe the path to humans would have looked very different. I sometimes wondered what it would feel like to sit among a group of Ouranopithecus, as if I were invisible and could watch them without being noticed. Would they remind me of gorillas, sitting calmly in groups, or of chimpanzees, always moving, chattering, and playing? Or would they feel different altogether, a way of living we can only guess at because the fossils don't tell us everything? The truth is, scientists don't know for sure how Ouranopithecus lived day to day. Fossils give bones, but not behavior. So researchers look at modern apes, gorillas, chimps, orangutans, and try to build bridges of imagination across millions of years. And that's what I tried to do too. If Ouranopithecus was as big as some believe, maybe close to a gorilla's size, then its life would have been slower, steadier. Large bodies need lots of food but also carry strength. That strength might have made predators think twice before attacking, especially if they moved in groups. And groups seem likely. Living together meant safety, shared care for infants, and more eyes watching for danger. I pictured them resting under trees during the heat of the day, their broad faces calm as they chewed hard foods. Younger ones tumbled nearby, pulling at each other's arms, climbing branches just high enough to test their courage. Every now and then, one of the older males would glance over, and the play would quiet down, as if the youngsters knew that too much noise might draw unwanted attention. Nights must have been tense. The open landscapes were beautiful under starlight, but also dangerous. Big cats prowled. Hyenas laughed in the dark. I imagined Ouranopithecus finding low, sturdy branches to settle on, curling their bodies close together. Sleep was not as safe as it is for me in my bed. It was fragile, broken by sounds in the dark, the snapping of twigs, or the heavy silence of a predator nearby. The more I imagined their social life, the more human it felt in small ways. Not in language or tools, but in the closeness, in the way they might have leaned on each other just to make it through. Survival wasn't just about strong jaws and big teeth, it was about connection. That part, I realized, hasn't changed. But while I imagined their lives, scientists kept returning to the fossils. That's where the debates began again. The jawbones and skull fragments showed features that seemed both familiar and strange. The thick enamel on the teeth reminded some of human ancestors, who also needed strong teeth for tough diets. The shape of the face, broad and deep, reminded others more of gorillas. So who was right? Some researchers argued that Ouranopithecus could represent an early step in the branch that led to African apes and humans. They said its features showed it belonged near the very root of that family. If that were true, then Ouranopithecus wasn't just another cousin, it was part of our story directly, maybe even the very ancestor of gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans all at once. But others disagreed. They said the similarities were just coincidences. Ouranopithecus, in their view, was more like a gorilla that never quite made it. A branch of the family tree that stretched across Europe but didn't lead to us. In that version of the story, Ouranopithecus eventually disappeared, leaving no descendants, just fossils in the rocks of Greece. I found it fascinating that both sides could look at the same bones and see different stories. One saw a beginning, the other an ending. And maybe both were right, in their own ways. Evolution isn't a straight line, it's a tangled web of starts and stops, of paths taken and paths abandoned. Ouranopithecus might have been one of those experiments of nature, a trial run for survival strategies that would later appear in others. But here's something else that kept me hooked: the timing. Ouranopithecus lived around 9 million years ago, right when scientists think the ancestors of African apes and humans were splitting from other groups. That makes it tempting to put Ouranopithecus at that very crossroads. Too perfect to ignore, but also too uncertain to prove. When I thought about this, I realized how fragile the answers are. If just one more fossil were found, an arm, a leg, even a pelvis, the whole debate might change. We might suddenly know if Ouranopithecus moved more like a gorilla or more like something closer to us. We might finally place it on the tree with confidence. But until then, it remains suspended in mystery, a face from the past without a clear label. In a way, that made me admire it even more. Ouranopithecus wasn't just a clue, it was a challenge. A reminder that the story of human origins isn't finished, that we're still piecing it together like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. I wondered what it would be like if scientists did find more fossils tomorrow. What if they uncovered a skeleton buried in a Greek hillside, perfectly preserved? Would the headlines scream, "Direct ancestor of humans found in Europe"? Or would the arguments continue, each side pulling the evidence in their own direction? The thought made me smile. Because even if they argued, even if no one fully agreed, the discovery would still bring Ouranopithecus closer to us. It would no longer be just a name in books, but a creature we could see fully, from head to toe. But until that day comes, we only have the fragments, and the fragments tell us this much: Ouranopithecus was tough, it was adaptable, and it lived in a changing world. And in that way, it shares something very human with us. Because we too have always been shaped by change, forced to adapt, always standing on the edge of survival. Sometimes, when I thought about them, I imagined one Ouranopithecus staring across the grasslands as the sun set. Maybe it stood a little taller, just for a moment, to see farther. In that moment, I felt like it was looking across time, straight at me. Not as an ancestor or a cousin, not as proof or debate, but as a reminder that life is not about certainty.